I am really excited about this lecture. As you might know, the Days-Massolo Center does theme programming every semester. Our theme for this semester is the 60th anniversary of the historic Brown versus Board of Education decision. I saw Professor Noguera speak at the Posse Foundation annual meeting, and he spoke very passionately and convincingly about the ways in which education needs to change and the ways in which education is linked to the history of public policy and educational policy in this country. So right at that moment, I was like, great, we have a speaker, and thankfully he agreed to come here. So I'm very happy and fortunate to host him at our campus. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Professor Noguera is the Peter Agnew Professor of Education at New York University. He's a sociologist whose scholarship and research focuses on the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions and the factors that obstruct and promote student achievement. And he really speaks very powerfully on those topics and also writes a lot of articles and books on that topic as well. He holds tenured faculty appointments in the departments of teaching and learning and humanities and social sciences at the Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, Development at NYU. Long titles. Dr. Noguera is also the executive director of the Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and the Transformation of Schools. In 2008, he was appointed by the governor of New York to serve on the State University of New York Board of Trustees, and in 2014, he was elected to the National Academy of Education. Dr. Noguera received his bachelor's degree in sociology and history and a teaching credential from Brown University in 1981, where he also received his master's degree in sociology in 1982 and his doctorate from UC Berkeley in 1989. He has been a classroom teacher in public schools in Providence, Rhode Island, and Oakland, California. If any of you know about Oakland, you know how important that is and where things stand with education. He has held tenured faculty appointments at the Harvard Graduate School of Education and at UC Berkeley. His list of books will probably take about 45 minutes if I read all of them, but I'll tell you about his most recent one, which is Schooling for Resilience, which came out from the Harvard Education Press this year. He's also been a regular commentator on educational issues and other topics on CNN, MSNBC, National Public Radio, and other national news outlets. Please help me in giving a warm Hamilton welcome to Professor Pedro Noguera.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's so good to be here. My first time at Hamilton College, so I'm delighted to be here. I thought it was still going to be warmer, but weather didn't cooperate today, but I hear it's going to be nice tomorrow. I really want to commend the campus for recognizing the 60th anniversary of the Brown decision, because in many ways that milestone marked the beginning of the end of American apartheid as a legal system. Right? And we don't think of it like that because we don't think of apartheid as a part of the American story, but very much is. And how many of you saw the Roosevelts? Probably not many of you saw it on PBS. you get although it was really about them, but these three figures, Teddy, FDR, and Eleanor, and I give them a lot of credit for giving Eleanor such a prominent place in the series. So much of that history, aside from being about war and depression, was also about race and the place race held in America. And Eleanor Roosevelt, in particular, having been a champion, unlike FDR and Teddy, for racial justice. So recognizing this history, I think, is really important, and where we've come. The sad thing is, I would say we haven't come nearly as far as we should have. That is, although de jure segregation, that is segregation by law, legally sanctioned segregation, has come to an end, de facto segregation is still very much a part of American society. In fact, one of the ironies is that today, schools in the North and the West are more likely to be segregated than schools in the South. Right? Much higher rates of segregation. New York City has some of the most segregated schools in the country right now, which is, again, ironic when you consider the diversity of New York and you also consider the fact that many neighborhoods, particularly in Brooklyn, are rapidly gentrifying. Which would suggest that the opportunities based at least on residents are there to create more integrated schools, but that's not yet happening. So I want to look at what the implications are for maintaining a dual system of education, as we continue to do. That is, schools for African Americans, Latinos. In many cases, Latinos are more likely to be segregated today even than African Americans. And I should add here, it's segregation not based simply on the basis of race, but of class, right? Because we concentrate poor kids in schools. Middle class, African American, Latino children are much more likely to attend integrated schools. But what are the implications for this for us today? Now, this is also the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act and of Title I. Title I was the act that President Johnson had the great courage and foresight to implement, which brought extra resources into schools serving poor children. It was framed as compensatory education because of a recognition, and it's interesting because Lyndon B. Johnson, before becoming a politician, had been a teacher in South Texas, teaching mostly children of Mexican descent. And many say that it's that experience that led him to realize how important it was to equalize opportunities through education. As I'll show in a moment, we've come a long way from that focus of equalizing opportunities. In fact, I would argue that the two most important issues that would help in creating a level playing field in education for all children are not even on the policy table. And those are racial segregation and school funding. Because throughout this country, and we're one of the only countries that does this, we consistently spend the most money on the children who come from the wealthiest backgrounds and the least money on the children who come from the poorest backgrounds. And the only people who say that money doesn't matter are usually people with lots of money. Right? And so, as I'll show in a moment, not only are our schools implicated in reproducing inequality, in many cases they are the sites where inequality becomes permanent for many children. So as a society, and the society we live in is becoming more and more diverse, not less so. Right now, the majority of children in public schools in the United States are what we call children of color, right, which is, you know, a euphemism for children not considered white. What does that mean for our future if we maintain this kind of blatant inequities in our schools? So those are some of the issues I'd like to look at with you today. I want to start just by pointing out that throughout our history, we have seen schools as important to our democracy. If I get this to work, even more so, but maybe not. Alex de Tocqueville, the French political philosopher exploring the United States, commenting about the emergence of democracy in this country, wrote back to a friend in France and said, imagine, if you will, a country made up of people from all over the world who speak different languages and have different religions. What will hold them together? That was the question he posed. And I would say that question has always been answered first and foremost by our schools. That is, we've looked to our schools, to our public schools, to hold us together, to make Americans. And that first and foremost meant teaching English to immigrant children, but it meant much more than that, teaching American custom, American ways. And whether the immigrants came from Ireland or from Slavic nations or from Latin America, Africa, anywhere in the world, we have first and foremost turned to our schools to integrate them into our society. Now, what's interesting about that history is we have often given schools no guidance on how to do that. No guidance on how to deal with language differences or cultural differences and what to make of them. But we've relied on our schools, and I would say we very much still do today. And so even now, as the country is in a big debate about immigration and about whether or not we should continue to welcome people from abroad, including children who are now on the border, unaccompanied minors. Fact of the matter is, if they get here, they will be allowed to go to school. Because the courts have consistently ruled, regardless of your background, regardless of your status, all children have the right to an education in this country. That's true for the undocumented, it's true for the homeless, it's true for the children whose parents are incarcerated, it's true for all children. All children have access to public education. The courts have been consistent. The courts have never said they should have access to equal education, just that they should be able to go to school. And so now we still find our schools, and someone was just telling me that schools in Utica in particular, now grappling with this question of how to integrate and serve large numbers of immigrants and refugee children. Many of those refugees come as war refugees who have experienced trauma and who are carrying a number of other challenges go far beyond learning English. And again, schools typically not having the resources to address their needs. But I would say that our public schools are increasingly all that's left in this country of the social safety net for children. That is, even schools that fail at meeting their educational needs are still the one place families can turn to for breakfast and lunch and heat in the winter and adult supervision, and if they're lucky, a school nurse. And while that might not seem like nearly enough, because we want them to also learn to read and write and do math and history, fact of the matter is there's no other institution that is stepping up and say, we will do the job. It's one of the reasons why I say when we criticize public education, we've got to be mindful of the fact that no other institution does what public schools do. We also look to our schools to desegregate this country. Right? That's Little Rock, Arkansas, Central High School, when President Eisenhower literally sent troops in because of the mobs that were there to block 9 African-American children from enrolling. And the fact that it took federal troops to enforce the president's order, which was enforcing the court's order, speaks to the degree of resistance in this country to that idea. And what many people don't realize is that resistance to racial integration was not just about African Americans. San Francisco did not allow Japanese children to enroll in its public schools until 1947. Throughout the South, Mexican children were denied access to public schools, except for separate schools. And so this history of maintaining racial boundaries in education is an important part of our past. A past that took major efforts on the part of our government to try to undo. Which is, again, one of the reasons why when you consider that this is not something we've talked about. We did not hear President Obama make a speech about the significance of the Brown decision. It went by, it's gone by pretty much unnoticed, at least from any official headquarters. You didn't hear Governor Cuomo talk about it. And what's ironic is they all talk about education as the civil rights issue of the 21st century. That's one of the rhetorical lines they like to put out, but they never explain what it means. Nor do they talk about this legacy that we're still contending with of racially separate schools. Right now, we are in the midst, despite the fact that it appears the recession is receding, of one of the periods where poverty has risen to the highest levels over the last 30 years. 22% of American children are poor. That means come from families whose household incomes fall below the poverty line. In states like Michigan and California, 1/3 of the children are poor. Talking to a group of principals in Michigan who told me that on Fridays now they send food home on weekends because many of the children have no guarantee that they'll eat again until Monday. Food emergency is a crisis in America today for many children, including right here in New York State. Upstate New York has high poverty rates in many of the depressed towns. And as poverty increases, it has an impact on our performance. UNICEF did a study of the 30 richest countries in the world, comparing how they were doing in child well-being. They created an index that included everything from mental health to nutrition to academic achievement. The United States came in 24 out of 25. Only the United Kingdom was below us. Now, we ignored that result. We focused a lot on the PISA results. Right? The PISA is the program in student assessment that compares the OECD nations, and we've been dropping in those ranks too. Dropping in science, dropping in math, dropping in reading. South Korea, which was previously not even ranked, is well ahead of us. And each time the rankings come out, policymakers get pissed off blame the schools, blame teachers, say something is wrong, we've got to raise standards. Raising standards has become our strategy, our national obsession when faced with evidence that we are slipping. But the fact is that when you start to disaggregate the performance of American students, what you start to realize is what's really ailing America is poverty. Because if you were to control for poverty, that is the districts where less than 25% of the children are poor actually do, we would be in the top 10 of nations. But when you include poverty, which we have to because those children are part of this country as well, then we drop significantly. But poverty is the issues that we haven't been addressing. It's ironic because No Child Left Behind has been federal policy since 2001. It's a great slogan, isn't it? No Child Left Behind. The slogan came from the Children's Defense Fund. But when Marian Wright Edelman came up with that slogan, Leave No Child Behind, her intention was not to ensure that we tested kids frequently. She had something else in mind, like nutrition and health care and all the other things we know children need. But again, that's not part of the national discussion. Now, I do want to acknowledge that in recent times, the Obama administration has made preschool, at least talked about the importance of expanding access to preschool. New York City has gone to great lengths to expand access to preschool. And the state, incidentally, that's done more to expand access to preschool is Oklahoma. They've been doing it for years. I met with the governor of Oklahoma and asked, why is Oklahoma a leader? Because you wouldn't expect a red state like Oklahoma to be a leader in preschool. The governor said, well, we've seen the research and the importance of starting early. I said, well, you need to share that research with your other governors because that's not what we're doing elsewhere. And it's because we don't do it, what we're not acknowledging is that a huge part of this so-called achievement gap that we're fixated on is a preparation gap. The fact that large numbers of kids are simply not getting the support they need during infancy that would prepare them for school. Every other country in the world provides universal access to school. Every other wealthy nation, that is. And so we've got to ask ourselves, what is going on? Why is it that we find ourselves in this situation? In a situation where increasingly we're asking schools to solve problems related to poverty. In effect, that's what's happened in this country. Because unlike other institutions, schools can't ignore hungry children. Schools can't ignore homeless children. Schools can't ignore kids who have no families. They may want to, they may try to, but the fact is, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to know hungry kids don't do that well. And kids who don't have a stable place to live probably won't get their homework done. And some of those children who have trouble reading actually need eyeglasses, but no provision for eyeglasses. So we have asked our schools to serve all children, which is, I think, a very bold democratic promise, but we have not given schools the resources or the supports they need to get that job done. And in one of the ironies, and I think a distortion of equity, and New York State, I think, exemplifies this as well as any state, we now hold the children in Utica to the same standards as the children in Scarsdale. They take the same test. You don't get a Utica bonus. Even though we know very well that in Scarsdale, not only are they getting more spent on them per student, but their families provide more. Because they have resources to invest in their children. They invest in summer school. They invest in violin lessons. They invest in braces if they need it. Everything they need and more taken care of by the families. Not the case in Utica, Schenectady, Buffalo, Rochester, and go on throughout New York. And that's true throughout the country. And so consequently, wherever you find high concentrations of poor children, almost always we find high rates of failure. And the narrative about why they fail does not focus on unmet needs. It focuses instead on lazy teachers. Because there's a presumption that if maybe we just could kick them hard enough, push them hard enough, that we'd get better results. In fact, that's what No Child Left Behind, one of the assumptions behind it. If a school is failing, then we threaten the school. We threaten it with closure. We threaten with takeover. We threaten to fire the teachers, fire the principal, as if it's lazy people running these schools. You hear the commissioner talk about Buffalo. You would swear there must be incompetent, lazy people working in schools in Buffalo. The fact is that New York State has been in control of schools in Roosevelt, Long Island now for over 15 years. And Roosevelt still has failing schools. So in a system that talks so much about accountability, absolutely no accountability in the state of New York for what's happened to children in Roosevelt. It's a policy that makes no sense. It's a policy that is actually contributing to more failure. The assumption is that you can use pressure and humiliation to get schools to improve, and we have no evidence at all that that will ever work. How many of you are from Florida? I know there's a couple people from, a lot of Floridians. So as you know, those of you from Florida, the state of Florida puts letter grades on schools. You go to an A school all the way down to an F school. State puts the grade out there. Now, I would say that if the state of Florida puts an F on the school and still allows children to go, the state should be sued. Because they know that school is not fit based on their criteria, but they still allow children to go anyway. It would be like if Hamilton College knew that this building was contaminated with asbestos. I'm not saying it is. But if they said, have a nice time anyway, you say, that's negligent. Some lawyer would be ready to sue. So I visited Edison High School in Miami. It's a triple F school. I asked the principal, how did you get to be a triple F school? He said, well, you simply failed the FCAT 3 years in a row. That's the state exam. I said, what happens if you fail again? He said, well, we will fail again because over 80% of our kids don't speak English. Haven't been in the country long enough. They can't pass an exam in English. I said, well, what happens if you fail a fourth time? He says, well, the state says they'll take us over. I said, you worried about being taken over? He says, not at all. I said, why not? He said, because there are too many schools just like us all over Florida. They can't take over that many schools. He says, what's more, you know the crazy thing is? Do you think the state would know what to do if they took us over? Do you think there's some secret recipe they've been holding back on that they will now make available to the children at Edison High School? It's a farce. But this farce is being played out, different versions of it, throughout the country, and has been for a while. And the sad thing is that we allow it to continue. I want you to take a look at this quote, and I'll read it out because I think it's worth taking note of. This is by the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz at Columbia. The United States has become the most unequal country among the advanced industrial countries. We have less opportunity than not only all of Europe, but any of the advanced industrial countries for which there is data. And what that means is very simple. The life chances of an individual are more dependent on the income and education of their parents than in other countries. And an implication of that is people born in the bottom who unfortunately choose the parents who were poor or not well educated will be more likely not to be able to live up to his potential. That is, we were purposefully a country founded on the ideal that what we wanted to reward was talent and ability, not birthright. We didn't want to be a caste society. But what Stiglitz is pointing out, and the ETS, the Educational Testing Service, is known for years, is that we already are a caste society. That is, the strongest predictor for how well you do in school is family income. And when you combine family income with how much education your parents had, especially your mother, because for most children, the mother is the first educator, you can predict with great consistency how well a child will do in school. Now, that should be disturbing to all of us because every once in a while, kids who are poor, kids who are homeless, kids who are in foster care, kids who come from the trailer parks or the projects excel and do great things because they're so resilient that despite all the obstacles, they still manage to excel. Now, I bet you, I don't want to call anybody out, there might be some people in this room who fit that background. I do. I was born in Brooklyn, New York, Brownsville. Few Brooklynites here. Grew up in the projects, Tilton houses. My parents, there you go. Not many professors come out of Brownsville. Mike Tyson, Biggie Smalls. But I would bet you that if we were focused on using education to expand opportunity, we could get a lot more. We get professors, we get engineers, we get doctors, we get lawyers. You know how I know that? We can get football players from just about anywhere. Why? Because we love football. There's a little town in Florida called Belle Glade. The Floridians might have heard of it. Outside of West Palm Beach. Belle Glade is dirt poor. Most people don't have indoor plumbing. High illiteracy, high unemployment. But Belle Glade has produced more professional football players than any town in America for the last 20 years. Some people say it's because the grass is so high, it makes you run fast. I say it's because we love football. And we will find football players there. We'll find them anywhere. Or basketball. But that's a reflection, again, of our priorities. And those priorities are producing this inequality that Stiglitz is speaking to. And I would say that the growing inequality is as threatening as climate change. As threatening as climate change. And we're seeing it right now as we watch this Ebola crisis take off in West Africa. Because it's not merely the disease that's a threat. It's the deep poverty. It's the lack of infrastructure. It's the lack of doctors. Why does Sierra Leone have no doctors? That's because they're all here, working in our hospitals. There are more doctors from Ghana in Washington, D.C. alone than in all of Ghana. It's not because they don't need doctors in Ghana. Inequality is a global phenomenon, but it's also very much an American one, too. And because of this vast inequity in wealth, we are not able to solve many of the huge pressing problems that confront us as a nation. And one of the things that struck me from watching the Roosevelts last week was how much both Teddy and FDR got that. I mean, and these were elites, right? They come from some of the wealthiest, powerful families in America, but both of them got it. Eleanor's great quote was, "We do well when we all do well." So simple, but so true. And FDR's quote was, "There are those who hate me for what I'm doing." Talking about the New Deal. He says, "I welcome their hatred." Because he got it, that in putting Americans back to work and in building this infrastructure, you know, so many of the highways and roads and tunnels we use now were built during that period, that it made the whole country stronger. But that's no longer part of the national conversation about inequality. Inequality is growing, and because it's growing, gaps in academic performance are set in place. Sean Reardon at Stanford, an economist at Stanford, says the rapid growth in the rich and poor educational gap provides a ray of hope. If the relationship between family income and educational success can change this rapidly, that is, get worse, then it is not immutable, inevitable pattern. What changed once can change again. Policy choices matter more than we have recently been taught to think. The time in this country's history when we were making the most progress in reducing gaps in academic performance, particularly between African American and white students, was the 1970s. And it wasn't simply because of what we were doing in schools. It's because of what we were doing outside of school. Because the war on poverty was still taking place, because there were housing programs and job programs and health care programs, and consequently we saw gaps shrinking. Since that time, those gaps have widened. And that's part of what we don't recognize, is that the gaps in achievement are really nothing more than a manifestation of inequality. That is, you will never see gaps related to academic performance eliminated when you continue to have these kinds of gaps in wealth and opportunity. Right now, black household net worth is $6,314. Net worth, not income, net worth in terms of wealth, compared to white household net worth. This came from an article by Nick Kristof in the New York Times 2 weeks ago. Pointed out that the disparities right now in this country are greater than they were in South Africa during apartheid in 1970. When we see Ferguson and those scenes that we saw across television for not a day but for several days, what should scare us is not Ferguson that most of us had never heard of if we weren't from St. Louis. It's the fact that there are hundreds of towns just like that throughout this country. Camden is a Ferguson. Buffalo is a big Ferguson. Going down the list. And the interesting thing, when you look at the 10 poorest cities in the United States, only 4 of them are black. 3 of them are white. 2 of them are Latino, Mexican. This is not simply a racial problem, but it is profoundly racial too. And so part of what we've got to recognize is that disparities are widening in wealth, in health, life expectancy, kinds of diseases, even in something like infant mortality. We have rates of infant mortality in certain cities that rival those of third world countries. Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, has rates of HIV infection that rival that of many African nations. We have 2 million people, over 2 million people in our prison system. More than any nation in the world at any time in history. And we have dropout rates in major cities across the country that are 50% and higher. This is America today, 2014. And all of these gaps in income and wealth, in the Latino population that's growing rapidly, right, fastest growing population in the country, huge disparities in educational attainment, much lower rates of high school completion, college completion than other groups, which means Latinos more likely than other groups to be permanently trapped in low-wage jobs. They all follow a very common pattern. Those who have the least financially do the least well educationally, do the least well in health. And so the only chance we have of being able to change this is if we start to understand what it is we're dealing with. Which means, first of all, we have to stop pretending that we can solve this through education alone. Can't solve it through education alone. We've got to take on a much more integrated approach than we have as a country. And in education, we've got to start recognizing that part of this is about a preparation gap that I spoke to already, but it's also about an allocation gap, about the way we fund schools and allocate resources. And it's about gaps in opportunities, opportunity to learn. And I would say that if we spent much more time focused on that, we could start to change and move toward a more equitable society. Right now, 40% of public schools don't offer preschool. 50% of blacks, 67% of Latinos, and less than 50% of Native Americans have access to AP courses, advanced placement courses. It's interesting, you know, when we hear all this debate about affirmative action, about whether or not we should get rid of it, how come people don't say, well, let's start by making sure everyone gets preschool? Because if we really wanted to create a level playing field, why would we want to start just at college and ignore everything that was supposed to be done to prepare you for college? Why wouldn't we at least make sure that in high school kids had equal educational opportunities? These issues are not part of the national conversation about education or race. Instead, what we have is a number of public officials who not only say that education is a civil rights issue of the 21st century, they say things like poverty is not the problem. Listen to this one. In the debate over how to fix American public education, many believe that schools alone cannot overcome the impact that economic disadvantage has on a child. The life outcomes are fixed by poverty and family circumstances, and that education doesn't work until other problems are solved. This theory is in some ways comforting for educators. The problem is the theory is wrong. It's hard to know how wrong because we haven't yet tried to make the changes that would tell us. But plenty of evidence demonstrates that schools can make an enormous difference despite the challenges presented by poverty and family background. This was an op-ed in the Washington Post by Joel Klein, the former chancellor of New York City Public Schools, by Janet Murguia from the National Council de la Raza, and by Michael Lomax, who is the head of the United Negro College Fund. This idea that poverty is not the issue is what's currently driving the education reform agenda. It's the reason why poverty is not talked about. It's the reason why we pretend that you can hold the kids in Utica to the same standards and expectations as the kids in Scarsdale. And despite ample evidence that it's not working, we continue down that path. And we're going to watch it again now with the Common Core standards. Because they continue to believe that if you simply raise the bar, which the Common Core standards would do, and I'm not necessarily against that, that you will somehow miraculously improve performance. It's like if you can't run a mile in under 7 minutes, we're going to ask that you do it under 6. But we're not going to give you a personal trainer or new running shoes. We're just going to ask you to run faster. That's essentially what we're asking schools to do. And again, no evidence that that current strategy is going to work, but lots of commitment to it. So I have been amongst a number of other people across the country, policy makers, educators, research scientists, who can say, you know, we need a different approach. One we're on is not working. We need to do something different. And part of what we need to do is ask different questions. Instead of asking how to raise achievement, we should be asking, under what conditions could schools mitigate the effects of poverty? What would we need to do for those schools in order for that to happen? And is it reasonable to expect schools to break the cycle of poverty? And if so, how? How would that work? What would they have to do? Well, here's the thing. We actually have examples of schools in this country right now that are doing it. That is, schools that serve poor kids, where poor children do extremely well. I can name schools right now that serve immigrant kids, that serve African-American kids, that serve homeless kids, that serve kids in the projects, kids in the trail parks that do extremely well. And the existence of those schools is all we need to know. The problem is not the children. There's nothing inherently wrong with the children. What is wrong is the policy approach. What is wrong is the fact that many of those children go to schools that simply can't meet their needs. But when we find ways for that to happen, amazing things can happen. So we have good research right now. It comes out of the University of Chicago showing us what it takes to create schools that succeed even under difficult economic conditions. Study was done of 10 years of school reform in Chicago. They asked the question, why did some schools improve? Why did some schools not only improve for a little while, but continue to improve? They had sustained improvement. Most didn't. But what were the characteristics of the schools that improved? And lo and behold, they found, well, they got 5 things in common. They have a coherent strategy for delivering instruction. Meaning what? Meaning it's not just every teacher doing their own thing, or assigning brand new teachers from Teacher America to teach very challenging kids. Bad strategy. Means that there's ongoing development of those teachers in content knowledge, in pedagogical skill, in how to meet the needs of different learners. There's a strong connection between parent and community because over 50% of student achievement is influenced by what parents do. There's a culture and a climate that's conducive to learning. The values, the norms are all aligned with the goal of helping kids to learn and to grow. And then lastly, there's leadership. Leadership that can drive the change, leadership that can build a coherent strategy within the school to support children. Now, the good news, as I said, is some of these schools exist. So you can visit them. We have, in New York City, several schools that we call community schools, and to Mayor de Blasio's credit, he's trying to create more of them, where kids get an extended day. They get preschool, they can get social workers on site, they can get health services right there. There's parent education going on. That is, the school has a much larger vision than the typical school. Now, the most famous of these is the Harlem Children's Zone. Right? A lot of people have heard about Jeffrey Canada and the work he's doing with 6,000 children in Central Harlem. But Jeffrey Canada has access to a $170 million endowment, which is something that most other schools can't do. But there are examples of schools. For example, Children's Aid Society has been doing it in other parts of New York. In Tulsa, the city of Tulsa is committed to doing that in every school in Tulsa. Oklahoma, once again. I've been there 2 years in a row now. They say our goal is to build a safety net for children in Tulsa, starting with preschool but going well beyond. So even the high schools have full-service schools. In addition to thinking about the social needs of children, there are schools that are showing us, we can actually reduce dropout rates by preparing kids for jobs, and not jobs that are dead-end, low-wage jobs, but jobs that actually have a future. So the East Bay Biotech Academy, I actually helped to get started over 22 years ago, started because we were working with a failing high school. And I approached a local biotech firm, Bayer Laboratories, produced Bayer aspirin, among other things, about building an academy at our school. And because they're a German firm, and in Germany they use apprenticeships as a way to get young people into technical fields, Bayer bought it. To be in the academy, you had to do 4 years of math, 4 years of science, which is unheard of for kids from the school we were in. But they got paid internships and guaranteed of an entry-level job in biotech when they finished, paying $16 an hour. That academy now has 7 high schools, 5 community colleges, 2 4-year colleges, because it's a pathway into a career, not merely a dead-end job, and 4 biotech partners. We could be doing that in Utica, in Schenectady, Syracuse. That is not simply in biotech, but in renewable energy, in all the fields where we know there's potential for job growth. In all the fields where we are now importing labor from abroad. One of the reasons why Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg are advocates for immigration is they want to continue to bring in highly trained engineers from India and China. We could produce engineers here if we were focused on that work. We'd also need to change just the way we think about learning in schools and start to draw on some of the research in neuroscience and in other fields which focus much more on engagement, less on achievement. So many schools right now are fixated on raising test scores, which means what? It means taking away anything that's not on the test. Music's not on the test, so you see schools taking away music. Art's not on the test, art is gone. Phys ed, recess, not on the test. So in the name of higher test scores, you see kids in double period math, double period literature. So a study said that eating lunch was good for test scores, and I said, thank God. Thank God, they might take lunch. But that's the craziness. That is that we know children need a well-rounded education. We've known that for years. It was common in this country for every kindergarten teacher to have a piano in the classroom up throughout the 1960s. Because we knew that music was a foundation for learning, and every kindergarten teacher knew how to play the piano. Music is still important to kids. Think about how many kids who can't read have memorized the lyrics to hundreds of songs. There are schools in New York right now that are focused on engagement, and they're using assessment differently. Instead of using assessment as a weapon on kids and teachers, they're using it as a tool to guide instruction. And they're looking at real evidence. Can kids write? Can they do research? Can they think independently and critically? And the results from those schools, those 38 schools, are very promising because the kids coming out of them are doing better in college than kids who have come out of traditional schools. So again, there are examples of schools that are doing this differently, and some of them are in high-poverty communities. This is a school in East LA. Did you go to Hollenbeck? Okay. You went to Hollenbeck? Who went to Hollenbeck? You did? Okay, I know she's from East LA too. So look at this. This is a math class. Kids are out of their seats. Kids are working together, talking together, moving. So immersed in the lesson. Teacher can stand back and talk to me. If she wanted to, she could do yoga. Because she doesn't have to hover over the kids. Kids are in control of learning. Now she gets to facilitate learning and move amongst them, and provide additional support to kids who need more support. We need to create more classrooms like this. We need to show teachers how to do that. Because these kids in East LA, who are these kids? These kids are coming from poor families, many of them recent immigrants, many of them undocumented. But they are performing at high levels. And they're lucky because many of them will go to Garfield High School. Garfield High School is the place where Jaime Escalante once taught. And if you haven't seen the movie Stand and Deliver, I'd encourage you to go watch that movie. It's a little old. But it's inspiring and it's true. Because Jaime Escalante was this crazy Bolivian engineer who thought kids from East LA could learn calculus and could take the advanced placement test in calculus. And he got kids to take it and to pass. So, of course, they thought he cheated. So they sent in the investigators to require the kids to be retested, and when they passed again, then they sent in researchers to study what he was doing. And the researchers all came back and said the same thing. They said, we don't see anything special about his methods. It's just math. And that's because they didn't understand what he called ganas. What are ganas? What's ganas? Huh? Wanting, the hunger to learn, the desire to learn. That's what he was imparting on kids. He said, you're the descendants of people who built pyramids. You can do calculus. And he took them out and showed them where calculus was being used because he knew that he had to constantly expand their horizons of what they thought was possible because a good education has to break stereotypes. And the kids at Hollenbeck are following that tradition. And so we have examples of schools where this is going on right now. This is a program in Sacramento called Youth Speaks. They figured out you could actually use spoken word and rap as a way to get kids writing. And I've seen workshops of this many students where kids are writing about their lives. And because it's something very intimate and personal, kids have a whole lot to say. And it may not come out in the best grammar the first time, but guess what? Once you get them writing, now we can work on grammar and spelling and all the rest. And this is in schools where teachers say they can't get the kids to write. They're focused on using the popular culture as a medium for engagement. They're dealing with relevance, something that we don't get enough of in schools. And then there are schools like this one in South Africa that are showing us, guess what? You can draw on parents as a resource. Even very, very poor parents can become involved, and as they become involved, that can become a resource to help schools. So this is Sapphire Road's primary school in the townships outside of Port Elizabeth. One of the poorest communities I've ever seen. Over 80% of the people unemployed, some of the highest rates of HIV in the world, lots of kids, over 40% of the kids orphans, parents have died. When the principal, who was standing in the back with the camera, was assigned to the school, he said the school was non-functioning. Kids were not showing up, teachers were not showing up. It had been vandalized. He didn't know what he was going to do. So he decided he would hold a Thanksgiving party for the community. Not like our Thanksgiving, his own version. And had food and music, so people came. So he said, well, people said, why are you thanking us? He said, I'm thanking you for the support you're going to provide to the school in advance. Because this school can't make it unless you do. So I said, well, that's it. We like your spirit. He said, the first thing we got to do is put a stop to the vandalism. They said, well, we know who's been vandalizing the school. These are guys who are out of work. They call them Tutsi in South Africa. Thugs. He said, well, let me meet them. He talks to them about why he has to stop. And they explain to him that they're broke, they're unemployed. He cuts a deal. He says, you provide security at my school, I'll give you a place to live on the site. Now that's what happens. They live and provide security at the school. Go up to a group of parents and say, look, kids are hungry. We have land here. Let's start a garden. Now there's an abundant garden that not only provides food to the children, but also food to the community. There's a health station on site, staffed by parents. Nobody gets paid. Nobody gets paid. Now, unfortunately, they're not trained either. I said, what happens if a kid is really sick? They say, well, usually we just give them a glass of water and rub their head. Works half the time. If it's more serious, we get a nurse. Sometimes it takes days for them to come. The point is that this has become a flourishing, high-functioning school without an extra penny from the Ministry of Education, simply by drawing on community resources. If you could do that in the townships of Port Elizabeth, you could do that anywhere in the United States. And in some places in the United States it's happening, often more likely in rural areas than in urban areas. So we need a different approach, and the approach that I and others have been calling for, we call it a broader, bolder approach. It's a more integrated approach. It doesn't just focus narrowly on achievement, it focuses on health and education. It focuses on all the things that we know kids need. Because we know that it is by looking holistically at the needs of the child and the needs of a school that we can start to move towards a more equitable future. And our hope is that by pointing out examples like these, that people, because I think it's very hard in this political climate to get our policymakers to pay attention, but that if ordinary people say, hey, there is a different way than the one we're on, that maybe we could have a different kind of future. One of the things that strikes me now is that how many young people, we were talking about this earlier, today are not more, I don't know, when I was a college student, we were active, we were believed, we could change things. Different times, huh? Here's Brockton High School. Brockton High School in Massachusetts. Largest high school in the state of Massachusetts, 4,000 kids. You went to Brockton? All right. The only urban high school that gets a level 1 rating from the state. They decided to do something radical in 2001. When they were faced with the MCAS, where if you don't pass, you're denied a diploma, the teacher said, you're going to have to do something radical, not test prep. We're going to teach kids to read. And every teacher became a teacher of literacy, whether they were teaching math or science. Every teacher focused on teaching reading and writing. And because they did, by 2013, 1/3 of the students got the Adams Scholarship. They gave them a free scholarship to any public college in the state of Massachusetts. So these examples exist. They're not outliers. The largest school in Massachusetts, this is PS 28. We have fancy names for our schools in New York City. 40% of her students are homeless. She got the highest gains in literacy and math in 2012. And her whole strategy is about building that support system for families, for children. I sat there. She introduced me to her guidance counselor. She said, I should warn you before I introduce you. I got him from the Rubber Room. Anybody ever heard of the Rubber Room? Rubber Room is this place where they would put teachers who were written up. They could be there for years sometimes, collecting salaries, but not allowed to engage kids. I said, how do you know to get him from the Rubber Room? She said, I don't know why he was there in the first place, but he had been my guidance counselor when I was in school. So I knew he was good. So I asked for him, and they said, you could have him. So I go in there, and he's talking to a little boy, and I introduce myself to both, and I ask the little boy, why are you here today? He says, well, I'm here to learn how to be good. I said, is it working? He says, I hope so. I'm tired of being put out of class. And then they explained to me the school has a no suspension policy. Not allowed to suspend kids. Because they don't believe sending kids home to watch television is an effective form of discipline. They really do focus on teaching the child how to learn to be good, how to respect others, how to control themselves. Now, if you could do that in East New York, which is where this school is located, you could do that in lots of places in this country. The question is, why aren't we doing it? Why have we allowed ourselves to stay on this path that is producing more and more failure, that is driving good teachers out of the profession? There's a lot of teachers, especially people with good education, they don't like this work. They feel beaten down. They're being given a script and told, this is what you got to do, and we're going to come and monitor you, make sure you're on script. Well, if you're a bright student from Hamilton and becomes a teacher, that's not exactly what you got into the profession for. Most people go into the profession because they want to inspire kids. But inspiring kids is not happening nearly enough. And so we've got to keep in mind that the country's still changing, becoming more diverse, not less so. This inequality is a threat to our future. You know, the people I say should be most worried about what's happening right now in our schools are older white people. Because if you're getting ready to retire, and more white people are, right, you know that it is this generation of children that's going to have to work to support you. That's how the system works. The retirees of today will be dependent on the children. Our futures are interconnected. And that's what we don't see. And that's the reason why we should be glad immigrants still want to come. We should be really happy. The mayor of Schenectady. Anybody here from Schenectady? You're from Schenectady? The mayor of Schenectady, it's interesting, I heard his whole story. He had this plan to revitalize Schenectady. You know what his plan was? Recruit Guyanese immigrants. Now I'm thinking, why would anyone from Guyana want to move to Schenectady? But he convinced them. He went to churches. He went down into Brooklyn and convinced them you can get a house so cheap in Schenectady. And why did he want Guyanese? I don't know why he chose Guyanese. Right? But that's what he seized upon, right? Because they all speak English. And he got them to come, and Schenectady is reviving through the work and the contributions of that immigrant community. Immigration's always been good for America, whether they come from Ireland or Italy or Guyana or Mexico. America's always benefited. Still does. So we can't allow the politics of the moment to prevent us from solving real problems the country faces. So my hope to you here at Hamilton is that you will be true leaders out there, not just followers looking for a good job. Good job is important. But be more ambitious than that and try to do something that's going to help us solve some of these problems that this next generation is going to inherit. Thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A. I just ask one request that if you have a question, that you ask a question and not part A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. So we have time for like maybe a few questions. I'll open up to the audience.
Yes. Yes. Okay, student. Student gets the first. Yes. You know, she epitomizes, I think, much of what's wrong. I mean, she, you know, her mantra, if you saw the Newsweek article or the front cover where she appeared with the broom under the headline, Fire Bad Teachers, right? And that was going to be her strategy for remaking schools in D.C. She couldn't tell you who a good teacher from a bad teacher. But she, I mean, that is because a lot of times you put a good teacher in a bad situation, they don't look too good. But she fixated on that while ignoring so many other things. So I'll give you one example. I was doing some work with Ballou High School, which is within eyesight of the Capitol. This is a school where the vast majority of kids can't read. And the teachers there can't teach reading. And the sad thing is, it's not about money. I sat in a room with administrators from the school. They had over 20 administrators in a school with 600 kids. I said, wow, counselors, deans, assistant principals. I said, this is amazing. You got so many. Not one of them knows how to teach reading, though. And you know what else will shock you? That school has an amazing marching band. They perform all around the country. Not only do they play their instruments, they dance while they play. So they get invited everywhere. And not one of the kids knew how to play an instrument before they entered. It shows you if we value something and we prioritize it, we can do extraordinary things with kids, including teaching them to read. That wasn't part of her strategy, though. Brockton is very big. They vary. They vary. A lot of them are public. Some are charter. Some are private. If you go, there's a book called Dispelling the. It's called there's a report called Dispelling the Myth on the Education Trust website. You can see many of those, over 3,000 of those schools named. Well, that's a good question. The schools that are making a difference, it goes back to those 5 ingredients I said. They got the leader, right? So you look at Brockton High School, Sue Satchowitz, was she your principal when you were there? All right, she just retired. Okay, now it's interesting. So she calls me, she says, Pedro, I want you to know I'm retiring. I know you're talking about my school. I said, well, you worried about how your school's going to do? She said, not at all, because this is about shared leadership. The teachers are the ones who've been leading this. I've been supporting them. Right? So, but they always have in place leaders who understand they're willing to take some risk to do things to get the kids engaged, to make the kids feel welcome. And you know, that's a key ingredient. It's not the only ingredient, but it's certainly key. Here and then there. You. Yeah. Well, I certainly think it's helpful to have teachers who come from backgrounds that are similar to the kids. It's important just symbolically for the kids to see that someone who looks like them can also be a teacher. However, we know now from good research that you don't have to match the background of the kids to be an effective teacher. Right? That is that, and here's the thing we know, kids are less prejudiced than adults. Right? Kids will respond to caring adults regardless of race or class. So if you are a caring adult, you could come from suburbia, but if you're there and the kids can tell, I've seen many teachers like that, including Teach for America teachers, become very effective. So when I made that comment about Teach for America, I don't want to criticize the people who make that choice. I want to criticize the idea of putting them in the most difficult classroom. Why would we do that? Are you from Boston? Okay. Well, Boston has had pilot schools for a long time now, and some of them are very successful. And who's from Boston? Any Bostonians? All right. Boston School of the Arts, Fenway, a number of them that do really well. So I think we need to find ways to shake up the system to produce innovation. That's the reason why I support charter schools. However, I'm concerned about how we do that. I'm concerned, for example, the way policymakers are using charter schools, because right now it's framed on competition, not collaboration. Right? So the Success Academy schools in New York City are some of the best. You have kids in Harlem outperforming kids in Scarsdale. Right? But because of competition, other public schools aren't learning from them because they're like competing with each other instead. That, to me, is counterproductive. We need to try lots of different things, but learn from each other. I mean, it kills me. I had a brand new principal come to me, and she says, I need help. I said, what's wrong? She said, my kids are having food fights every day. I said, well, that's terrible. I said, well, but why are you coming to me? She said, because I'm afraid if I go to the Department of Education, they'll write me up. So I need help. So I take her to a school in her neighborhood, same kind of middle school, where they don't ever have food fights. And she sits there and she's watching the kids and she's so struck by the fact, well, what's the difference? It's the culture of that learning environment. And the thing is that when you see it, it seems so simple. But we are letting educators work in isolation, experiencing so much difficulty and frustration that a lot of times they start to blame their own kids, or because they don't even see that it can be done differently or is being done differently in other places. And that's what we should be doing a lot more. So yes, we should be shaking up the system. We should be experimenting with new modes of learning and new approaches to it, but we should not undermine the public system. Because as I said earlier, the public system is the only system that accepts everybody. And no one else is stepping up to say, I'll take them all. Very much. I know it well. You know, I spent 4 years working in Newark just before she came. And the biggest problem I have with Cammie Anderson, the current superintendent, is that she does not value, does not believe in any kind of community engagement. She thinks she's a savior and that she's only accountable to Chris Christie, right? And so even though you have students boycotting and teachers boycotting, she's tone deaf, I know best, even though she's not even from there. And the truth is, she has no long-term commitment to Newark. She will eventually get another job and be gone, like Michelle Rhee in D.C. Right? There's no deep commitment. And what we see now, the districts that make the most progress, it's because of community engagement. It's because of stability in leadership over time. She doesn't demonstrate any of that. And so even if some of her ideas might make sense, how she's going about it does not. And that's what I find so troubling. And unfortunately, there's many like her out there. Okay? So that's one of these ideas. So policymakers will fixate on something. Okay, let's just extend the day. So here's something basic we know. More of a bad thing is never a good thing. Right? So if it was bad till 3 o'clock, why do you want to make it till 5 o'clock, right? That's bad, right? Now, if you tell me, no, we're going to keep them till 5, but we're going to have music. We're going to do all these great things. It's okay. Now you have a plan for how to use the time. Problem is, I've seen schools that have extended the day, but they have no plan, so they just keep doing more of what they've already been doing poorly. So it's about the substance of the education, not simply the time. But time certainly matters. Middle-class kids get more learning time than poor kids. They typically get, even if they don't have a longer school day, they have after-school activities, right? And they get enrichment in the summer. Poor kids often don't get. So that gap in learning time contributes to these disparities that we've been talking about. Yes? Good question. I think both. Now, in our country, more of the responsibility is on the states, because education is a state matter. Think about this. The right to an education is not mentioned in the Constitution. The only way in which the federal government has historically intervened until No Child Left Behind was on matters pertaining to civil rights. Right? So rights of the disabled, language rights, busing. Now, with No Child Left Behind, the federal government has expanded its authority, right? And now sets mandates for states. But most of the work of improving schools really is a state responsibility, not a federal responsibility. Okay, let's get a professor. And I assume with the gray hair, he must be a re-entry student. Well, we need to constantly rethink it, but it's also hard to generalize about schools of education. There's great variation amongst them. Some programs, like Stanford, has a great residency model. So the way teachers are trained at Stanford or Ball State is much more like the way we train physicians, with real experts in the classroom with the novice teacher, right? Which to me makes a lot more sense. I would say, for example, at NYU, where I've been now, our teachers are very strong in the subject they teach, and they have good skills, but they're not so good at teaching actual kids. When it comes, well, think of it now. But this is the hard part, because we're taking these 22-year-olds and putting them into an overcrowded classroom with under-resourced and kids from a very different background. We're asking a whole lot of them. So the whole setup is wrong, because we not only take Teach for America teachers and put them with the most challenging kids, we do that with new teachers generally. Right? And that, I think, is just bad. So yes, schools of education could do it a lot differently, but I would also say universities are complicit, because many universities don't value education, treat it as a cash cow, and don't put the resources there either. Way back, and then I'll come over there. Invest in this. Are you from there? Oh, heard the story. Right. Social capital. Right. Mm. Right. Oh, absolutely. There's some problems that are way bigger than schools. Mental illness, for example. Right? Schools can't deal with that, right? I mean, so there are lots of issues that schools, and that's why, what we were trying to do in Newark till Cammie came was build a whole support system that involved hospitals, universities, private sector, nonprofits, all working in concert with schools. Right? That's basically what the Harlem Children's Zone has. That's right. So that you have a referral process. Boston has that. It's called City Connects. So that if a child comes in who's homeless, the school doesn't have to fix it, but they have someone they can refer that child to who can provide support for the child and the family. Right? So that, to me, not every community has those resources, but many communities have resources outside of the school that could support the school. And that's what I think we could do a lot more of. There was one hand there. And is that the last one? You call. It's your call. Okay. Yes. Mm. That's why I said we have to change the whole policy framework. Because I see that example that you cited playing itself out over and over again. You see right now, look at the cheating scandal that's going on. Right? So many schools, districts. Atlanta there was a great article in the New Yorker over the summer about the cheating that went on in Atlanta. And what we should all know is that Atlanta was getting praise. They were getting awards. Beverly Hall, the superintendent, they got over $500,000 in bonuses. Right? And there was systematic cheating. Now, the sad thing was there was also improvement in Atlanta, just not as much as they claimed. But under this kind of a system, create incentives to cheat, right? Because you attach bonuses to it or jobs to it. And unfortunately, that's what we see going on. So a lot of gaming of the system and instead of really focus. So right now, what Brockton stands out. Lynn didn't do what Brockton did. Right? Instead, what did Lynn do? Lynn brought in Kaplan. We're going to get these kids ready for the test. Right? Well, guess what? Kaplan doesn't teach you to read. So all the test prep in the world won't make up for the fact you have no skills. So you can't, there's no way to game the system to get kids educated quickly. You actually have to do the work. And that's what we keep, that's again one of the faults of reform. We keep thinking it's a gimmick out there, right? That if we just do Common Core, if we just do phonics, if we, the gimmicks change from year to year. But we keep ignoring those essential ingredients. Those have to be there, otherwise it doesn't work. So I'm in the middle of ongoing debate about that. In the past, before we only used the test score, right, we look at a bunch of other factors like grades and diversity, right? So then we got rid of that. Now we only look at your test score. Now there are kids, most of whom are Asian. Most of the kids are studying sometimes 2 years in advance for those tests, and they get in. And it's hard. I don't want to penalize those kids for their time and their effort. I would say, though, what makes are they really getting good education at Stuyvesant, right, or Bronx Science or Brooklyn Tech? And I would question it. I would question it because I would say that a lot of times teachers in schools like that don't teach very well. Right? Because the expectation is if you're so smart, it's on you. You're going to learn it. I studied Lowell High School in San Francisco, which is the same kind of school like Stuyvesant. The amount of cheating going on amongst the kids, right, rampant throughout the school. And the number one school the kids from Lowell were going to was San Francisco State, a relatively mediocre public university. Right? So, what's good education? The other thing I question is whether or not those kids are in fact gifted. Right? My wife went to Hunter, which is another one of those exam schools, so she tested in at 4, right? And I say, if you guys were really gifted, how come the gifts disappear as you get older? Right? I mean, most of them are just pretty ordinary, right? They're not Nobel Prize. There's a few. But a lot of them are just pretty ordinary. Now, I tell them, their real gift was their mom, who taught them to read at 4 or 3, right? And we confuse privilege with giftedness, and so making sure that we can provide quality education to more kids. That's the work I'm concerned about, not how to get more kids into these small number of select elite schools. Way back, and then I'll get you next. I think so. I think there should be much more emphasis on socioeconomic status and making sure that we're providing opportunities to kids from low-income backgrounds into higher education. So yes, I would say so. But at the same time, I think that's what we've been focused on in higher education for the last 30 years or so. But we've ignored all the preparation work. And so what ends up happening is we have so few kids to choose from coming out of high school who can actually even compete for these select schools. So we need to grow a lot more. Last one. You get the last one. you know, I would say, again, this is where leadership is needed, political leadership, and not just from the people we elect. It's got to come from below to push it, right, to force it. We will spend money on stadiums, right, tax dollars on losing football teams, right, and not invest in our children, you know, not invest in our schools. So it's really, we create it's a manufactured crisis. Right? We act like we're broke, and meanwhile, we're not. You know, California has gone through the same thing. California has seen its prison population grow to the point where the courts have said it is inhuman to keep people in these overcrowded prisons. You've got to let some of them out. So for the first time there, last 20 years, you see the prison population going down just because of the courts. And every dollar we spend to incarcerate is a dollar we don't have for education. It's so much. Who do we incarcerate? The people we fail to educate. So we're investing on the wrong side, you know, and that's what's got to change. And that's only going to happen if people insist on it. And so even if you don't go into education, care about it. Care about it. Thank you.